In our last lecture, I covered the beginning of the dictatorship period. What we're going to look at today is we're going to look at examples of dictatorships in 3 countries in Latin America. So something to note about all the dictatorships, regardless of where it is, whether it's in the countries we talk about or in other places, because there were others, they are all, number one, and above all else, anti-communist. They do not like communism, and they perceive anyone whom they don't like, therefore, as a communist. And because they are so anti-communist, they have the support of the United States, without which the dictatorship would simply not be possible. They are all pro-church. They believe in these kind of old colonial ideas of the way society should be run, so they are also pro-traditional gender roles. Women belong in the home, men belong in the public sphere, and also pro-social hierarchy. What I mean here is the idea that the poor should know their place and they should kind of keep their mouth shut. So the first case is going to be Brazil. Brazil was under a military dictatorship between 1964 and 1985. The military seizes power after the civilian government, 2 presidents after Getúlio Vargas falls from power in his second kind of term. The military seizes power after that government becomes more radical, and peasants in Brazil begin to increasingly call for greater land reform. Military forces, through laws, they rule quasi-constitutionally, which is to say they change the Constitution and create laws which allow them to act by decree. So they create a law that allows them to act without any other laws. They restrict civil liberty. They outlaw all but 2 political parties, both of which are pro-military. And they turn to repressing their, and I put enemies in quotes, enemies, because again, this is anyone who disagrees with the regime, whether this person is actually a communist or whether it's just somebody who thinks that the poor deserve, that there should be some kind of land distribution. Anything left of center or even a little bit right of center, the left of a little bit right of center, can fall into this category. You never know. Speaking out against the government itself can be dangerous. So from the 1960s to the early 1970s, an urban guerrilla movement arises. They engage in what the government considers, and most would consider, terrorist attacks inside the cities. They blow up police stations. They attack army recruiting centers. Bombs are left places. Sometimes policemen are shot. And the government responds with a really high level of violence. Not as high as other places, but nevertheless a surprisingly high level of violence. They arrest a lot of people. They form unofficial death squads. These are groups that will, once the police determine one person or another is possibly communist or is subversive, that person will just be killed. And yeah, I don't know, they got murdered, and that's what the police say. We'll look into it, and then they never do anything because they know full well that oftentimes it's members of the police that killed them. Also, there is a large-scale torture and disappearance program. What I mean here is a person goes into police custody, and they just disappear. The government claims, we have no idea where this person got off to. You should, file a missing persons report, which obviously doesn't actually do anything because oftentimes it's the police that have killed them. And this leaves their family in the horrifying position of not knowing whether the person is ever dead or alive, and the government never claims or acknowledges that it knew or knows where these people are. So it's a very all these dictatorships are very bloody and very severe. So in order to attract foreign money, the Brazilian military government cracks down on workers' rights. So things like capacity to strike is done away with. It also keeps wages very low. And in order to keep the middle and working class happy-ish, or at least not as upset, they spend a tremendous amount of money on infrastructure projects. We're not just talking roads here, we're talking really big projects like dams, dams on the Amazon River, among others. Temporarily, this does in fact create jobs. These massive infrastructure projects require a lot of people. Unfortunately, though, it does not really create income and so the government ends up going into a gigantic amount of debt Over time, Brazil ends up defaulting on its loans. It's no longer able to pay off the interest of all this money that it's borrowing. And once the Brazilian money, the value starts to decrease and decrease and decrease, a resistance, a peaceful as well as violent, but generally peaceful resistance to the military's rule comes to power. Workers strike. And in fact, Dilma, who's the former president of the United States, of Brazil, takes part in these strikes. And over time, as opposition grows, the military's capacity to hold on to power decreases, and they transition to a civilian government in 1985. So that was Brazil. Let's talk about Argentina. Argentina actually has two dictatorship periods, 1966 to 1973 and 1976 to 1983. Don't worry about what happens in between it. Perón comes back to power, but you don't need to sweat that. Similar goals as Brazil. Number one, get rid of the subversives or the communists, i.e. anyone who opposes the government, and attract foreign money. And they have similarly brutal methods, but actually in Argentina it's more violent than it is in Brazil. Arrests, disappearances, death squads, just like in Brazil. But the reason it's more violent is because there is a better organized resistance campaign in Argentina. Leftist paramilitary groups, the Montoneros were the most famous ones, they engage in a really legitimate, bloody attacks on military installations, on police stations, on government forces, and this forms a cycle of violence. The government represses groups with violence, so groups become more violent, which causes the government to repress them with greater violence. This leads to a level of arrests, torture, and government-run murder that is unseen in Brazil. Thousands of people die in Brazil. An estimated 20,000 people during the Argentine military dictatorships disappear, just go away. We have record now to indicate that sometimes they were some of the people who were tortured and disappeared were drugged and then taken on a plane and thrown into the ocean or thrown into the River Plate, the river that runs alongside the edge of Buenos Aires. This is a horrifically bloody affair. And in the shadow of all of this violence, the Madres de Plaza de Mayo come into play. These are mothers whose children have disappeared. And so they come wearing this very traditional sort of garb, and they stand in front of the Argentine presidential palace, the Casa Rosada, the Pink House, holding pictures of their children. At first, there are very few mothers who show up, but this grows and grows and grows. And they stand there essentially silently, just holding up pictures of their children facing the Casa Rosada. The government, the foreign press starts to notice, this is really embarrassing for the government, but the Argentine military doesn't do anything against them because these are moms, these are old women. The people who, obviously the children who disappeared are adults, so these are older women. And they're not doing anything wrong besides standing there with pictures of missing kids. Because keep in mind, the government supports this idea of traditional gender roles. And so, motherhood is super important to the military. And over time, as more and more mothers gather in the Plaza de Mayo, there is increasing pressure on the government to do something about it. The vast majority of these people, the mothers will never find out what happened to their kids. The Argentine government today even does very little to help people find out what happened. But it's the loss to Britain. In 1982, with the Argentine economy on the skid, much like in Brazil, they have a major debt problem, Argentina invades the Falkland Islands. Which they've had claim to for decades and decades. It's a small group of islands controlled in the South Atlantic, controlled by Britain. Britain goes to war, and they send a naval task force, and they reclaim the islands. And this the war is very poorly run by the Argentine government, and this is kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back. That's in 1982. In 1983, the last military government has to step down. And Argentina transitions to military rule. And our last case here is Chile. 1973 to 1990. On 11 September 1973, the United States backs a coup against Salvador Allende. Allende is a socialist, he's a nationalist, not necessarily a Marxist, but many of his followers are. His reform program was just too much for the United States to accept, and so they fund and train guys to go in and engage in this coup. The coup puts Augusto Pinochet into power. He's a colonel in the Chilean army. And unlike in Brazil or Argentina, where in this kind of long, rather long series of repression, violence happens, in Chile, what they do is, very quickly, they gather up all the members of the opposition, people who have supported Allende's political party, members of the Communist Party, members of the Socialist Party, etc., etc. They move them into a soccer stadium, the soccer stadium in Santiago, Chile, literally the soccer stadium inside the capital city, and there they kill and torture many of them. Those that they imprison a lot of them. Some of them just disappear. And after that, the resistance to the Pinochet government is not as robust as it had, as the resistance to the government in Argentina had been, or even in Brazil. The idea is gather them up immediately, eliminate the leaders, and the movement kind of falls apart. And that's what ends up happening. And Pinochet actually stays in power all the way until 1990, when there's a transition to civilian government. So 1990 isn't that long ago, I mean, if you think about it. So let's talk about some of the big ideas. What are the takeaways that we have from this lesson? Just a second. There's the question. There we go. Much better. Okay, so period of dictatorship represents the intersection of two really essential ideas, and two ideas that we've talked about from the 19th century onward. Number one, the notion of foreign intervention. These juntas are the military governments, is the Spanish word called junta, meaning like the people in charge. They are backed by the United States. We've seen in the neo-colonial period, and even during the neo-colonial period under Roosevelt, the U.S. Willingness to intervene in Latin America. Without United States support, these dictatorships would not have lasted, period. In fact, without United States support, it's doubtful these dictatorships would have even existed. But it's because of the United States' willingness to see the world solely through a Cold War lens. If you are a socialist, you're a communist. If you're anti-church, maybe you're a communist. If you're against foreign companies controlling large portions of your nation's economy, you're a communist. And communism has to be dealt with violently and immediately, because communism is going to make Latin America a satellite of the Soviet Union. This is the worldview. So foreign intervention increases, and the idea of the people as a problem. We saw this throughout the 19th century, from Bolivar to the liberals, people like Juarez, Alberti, Sarmiento, Porfirio Diaz. All of these people did not trust the common man. Like it says up here, they saw working class and rural poor as untrustworthy. This fades away in a lot of ways during the nationalist period. In fact, the idea of the common man becomes celebrated under people like Vargas, Getulio Vargas during the Estado Novo. But with the Cold War, this makes a spectacularly violent return. The old way during the liberal period had basically been to kind of take their land away and things like that. What we see now is violent repression of the working class and any subversives within the middle class. And by violent, I really do mean deadly violent. Extra-legal arrest, torture, and execution. And keep in mind that any resistance to the elite at this point is seen as communism, and communism must be coming from the Soviet Union. And so with the idea of foreign intervention intersecting with the idea of the people as a problem, this is what we see in the dictatorship period.